Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Swear Jar, the official podcast of the Academy of Business Communications, where we tell it like it is about corporate and employee communications and use occasionally colorful language to raise money for worthy causes. My name is Elizabeth Williams.
And I'm Andrew Brown. Today, we're going to talk about corporate stories. So we'll tackle how to tell great stories, what makes great stories, and of course, storytelling as a means to achieve organizational goals.
And we are going to be drawing on the insights from our very special guest, Paul Smith. Paul is a business storytelling coach and author of many books, such as Lead with a Story, Sell with a Story, 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, and even Parenting with a Story. He spent 20 years with Procter & Gamble, and then he did a crazy thing, and I will let Paul tell you that story. So welcome, Paul, to The Swear Jar. Tell us about your crazy thing and why organizations need good storytellers.
Thanks for having me on. Well, the crazy thing was leaving my cushy corporate job in my mid-40s, yet too young for retirement and with a wife and 2 kids and college funds to build and all that, to leave all of that and become an author and a speaker and trainer on storytelling, which, to my father sounded like a crazy idea, but it's been absolutely the best decision ever made. So I'm pretty happy with that.
Why should organizations look to storytelling and good storytellers?
The most important reason is that it works. It works so well and better than just about any other form of communication to accomplish your mission, your conversational objective. Humans just seem to be hardwired for stories and they communicate much more effectively. The underlying reason behind that is a very physiological one, right? So it turns out, and we've just learned this the last few decades from the cognitive science that's been done, and that is that human beings don't make the rational, logical reasons that we'd all like to think that we do, right? It turns out that we make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in one place in our brain. And then a few nanoseconds later, in another place in our brain, we rationalize that decision in logical terms. So we leave a decision thinking that we've made it for only the rational, logical reasons. But the truth is, many times our subconscious emotional brain has decided for us and we're just trying to catch up. So stories just happen to be particularly well suited to reach both sides of the brain, not just one, which our normal mode of communication only reaches that one logical, conscious thinking part of the brain. Stories can help you connect with the other side, and you need both if you want to be as effective of a communicator as you can be.
Paul, I think all of our listeners want to be as effective communicators as they possibly can. So that makes sense to me. Maybe you can help put some meat on the bones by sharing a story that you think is great, and then we'll deconstruct it into the components that absolutely have to be there in order for there to be a great story.
Corporate values are one thing that professional communicators often have to impart to the organization. So the company's ethics and values and culture. And the way we typically do that is we come up with a corporate values statement. And we type it up and it's on pretty paper and it's got 7 points on it or whatever. And we send it to everybody and it ends up in file drawers and probably doesn't see the light of day. That's not the most effective way to communicate company values. You have to have it. It's a good starting place, but it's probably not the right end point. So a better way is to communicate each of your values with a story. And a great story can communicate multiple values in a way that people will remember longer, they'll act on it more frequently, they'll be able to share it with other people. So, for example, imagine you worked at the company Walmart, right? And it's your first week on the job. And maybe in addition to giving you their corporate values statement, one of your boss just tells you a story about the founder of the company, Sam Walton, whose name you probably all recognize. And the story would be about back in the 1980s, when Walmart was rapidly becoming one of the biggest retailers. In the state of Texas in the US, the largest retailer was a company called H-E-B, H-E-Butt grocery chain, until about 1985 or 6. And that's when Walmart overtook H-E-B and became the largest retailer in the state of Texas and just about everywhere else. So what happened was the CEO of H-E-B, a guy named Charles Butt, the grandson of the founder, literally called Sam Walton on the phone in Arkansas and said 2 things. First, he said, "Congratulations. You're now the largest retailer in the state of Texas, and my family's company has been for decades until now. And secondly, I'd love to know how you did it. Like, you're clearly doing something right. I'd love to bring my leadership team to your headquarters on a learning mission and just learn what we can. Now, of course, Sam Walton would have been within his rights to just tell the guy to shove off, right? I mean, you're my competitor. I'm not telling you a damn thing, right? But he didn't. What he said was, well, I don't know what I can teach you, but I'll be happy to try. So they literally made an appointment for all these executives to fly to Arkansas and meet him at a local Walmart store. So on the appointed day at the appointed hour, all these executives show up in suits and start walking around looking for Sam Walton. And they find him at the end of this aisle. And so they start marching up the aisle, and Sam holds his hand up and stops them. He says, Charles, I'll be with you in just a minute. I'm talking to this young woman. He was trying to sell her an ironing board cover. Right? Like, he was literally like, telling her about all the different color patterns and quality and thickness and different prices. And eventually she got satisfied with one and put it in her buggy and, pushed off to the register. Sam Walton then turns around to Charles Butt and says, Charles, do you know how many worn out ironing board covers there are in this country? Well, we're going to sell 1 million of them this month. Now, what can I tell you about retail? First of all, they probably learned a lot just watching him sell that ironing board cover. But the point of sharing the story with you is, imagine you're that employee at Walmart and it's your first day and somebody told you that story. And let me just ask both of you, what lessons would you learn about the corporate values at Walmart?
The customer-centric nature of the organization comes through loud and clear in that.
Right. Customers number one. What else? Does something else strike you?
The very top of the house, the leadership team is as focused on the customer as the front line.
You know what, Paul? I was actually listening for different elements of the story rather than the lesson. So
okay,
come back to that. So
No
I was listening for something very specific.
Yes, Elizabeth, those two are correct. And if we spent another 10 minutes deconstructing the story, you'd probably come up with 4 or 5 others of lessons that you learned about what is valued at Walmart. And that's the point, is that story illustrates the value that the customer is number one at Walmart. They could tell you that the customer is number one, but you wouldn't really know what that means. But hearing a story about the CEO who made another CEO and that CEO's entire leadership team, who'd flown hundreds of miles and who'd been invited to meet with him at that moment, he made them wait while he took care of a customer. I mean, that speaks volumes about what is meant by the customer is number one. Even in a situation like this, the customer comes first. Stories do a much better job of communicating company values than simply a values statement. And a good story like that can illustrate multiple values. But if you don't have good stories like that, you probably don't have a strong set of company values, because values are just words on a piece of paper until they're tested in a moment like that. And that's what a story does for you, is it shares that moment and lets people evaluate it.
When you tell that story, Paul, it reminds me that the distinction between the story and the telling of the story can often get blurred. I liken it to, in a ballet, there's the music and the dance, and you can't separate the two, or it's very tough. And I was listening for some components or structural things in the way that you were telling the story. And you can tell me, have I got these wrong? But these seem to be some of those elements that helped propel the story and make it compelling. So one of the things is that in telling the story, you made it very physical. You used the words like marching up, that he held his hand out, he turned around. So you really made it very physical for a listener to understand. One of the other things that jumped out to me was that you created a tension. You talked about a recognized goal. You created a sense of mystery, and you made this very human. So those to me seem to scream out as elements of the story and in the way that you told the story. Tell me, as you see it as a storyteller, what are some of the things that make that a compelling story and the way you told it compelling?
First of all, A+ for your observational skills. I think those are all very correct in that those are certainly elements of a good story. And there are probably dozens of elements of storytelling, and I try to focus on what I think are the most important ones when I teach my audience. The few that I would mention to you that maybe come to the top of my list. First of all, recognizing that this is a moment that a story should be told, recognizing when to tell a story and when not to tell a story, because it's not all the time. Like, you shouldn't be telling stories all day long. In fact, I think it's only about 10 to 15% of the time is it appropriate to share a story. The other 85 to 90% of the time, you're just talking to people the way you normally talk to people.
What's an earmark for knowing when to tell a story?
Well, first of all, if you don't have a good story to tell, it's never a good time to tell a story. Don't tell a story if all you've got are lousy stories. It's a good time to tell a story when somebody isn't understanding the point that you're trying to make and you need an illustration of it. So that's often what storytelling is a concrete example of the theoretical, nebulous concept that you're trying to get across to people. Other good times are when you're trying to motivate them. Like, yeah, they get it, but they're not motivated to go do what I want them to do. So I want to share a story that will help motivate my audience or illustrate my vision in a way that they need it illustrated. Or there are stories you can tell to get people to be more collaborative together. So there are lots of different purposes. And Elizabeth, I think you're reading Lead with a Story now. So I think there's 20 some odd different types of leadership challenges where leaders need to tell stories. And I'm happy to share, what some of those are. In general, it's a communication technique that will bring clarity to nebulous ideas and abstract ideas.
One of the things that communicators really struggle with a lot when we're trying to communicate something like values is they are nebulous, they are squishy. Right? So if one of your corporate values is the customer always comes first, it's an easy thing to put on a coffee mug, but it's a really difficult thing sometimes to dimensionalize. And
Right.
I think that is one of the most important takeaways for why we want to put that into our mix as communications professionals.
I like that. Yeah, it goes on a coffee mug easily, but yeah, you need the story for people to understand it. Andrew, I think back to your question. So A, recognize when a story needs to be told. B, tell the right story. So you need to have a repertoire of stories to tell, or when it's time to tell a story, guess what? You got nothing. Your chambers are blank in your gun, right? You need a large repertoire of stories to draw on. And so I think leaders need to develop consciously and intentionally develop a repertoire of stories to be able to accomplish their leadership objectives. But once you've gotten past those two, you know that I need a story right now and I've got exactly the right story to tell. Then there are techniques you can use to craft better stories. And I think that's what you were listening for in my story. So those are things like, does the story have a good structure to it? Is there some emotional engagement in the story? Is there a surprise, hopefully a surprise ending? Is there dialogue, sufficient amount of detail for me to feel like I was there? I think you mentioned something like that. Those are different techniques that we could get into, however much detail you want to get into to how to accomplish those things. But there are definitely techniques to storytelling that make stories more effective than others.
Perfect.
As you mentioned, I'm just finishing up the Lead with a Story book, and you rightly remind me that I started at the beginning and I have many more I have to read to catch up to you. And in it, I was really struck by all the great stories, particularly from Procter & Gamble, but also Pizza Hut and Nokia. And I'm wondering, hopefully not putting you on the spot here, who is your favorite corporate storyteller and why?
It's somebody, I'm pretty sure I mentioned him in the book, in that first book. His name is Jim Bangel. And he's retired now, but he was the Procter & Gamble corporate storyteller. There was, and maybe still is today, one person out of the 80,000 some odd people, or 120,000 when I was there, people whose job was the corporate storyteller. And he got that, he was the first and only one at the time, corporate storyteller, and he got that title. So he was a statistician. He worked in the research and development department. And every month he had to write a memo to his bosses, basically explaining what he had done all month, right? So here's the research I did, and here are my conclusions and that kind of thing. And of course, there were tens of thousands of other researchers writing these dry and boring memos that only an engineer could appreciate. And he got bored with that. So one day, instead of writing his normal, boring corporate research memo, he wrote a story, and he gave it these whimsical fictional character names like Ed Executive and Sell a Case and Max Profit, the finance person. And, he gave these corporate titles funny names, and he had his characters go through some ordeal, and the ordeal taught them the lesson that is the same as the lesson he learned from his analysis that month. So instead of explaining what he'd learned over the course of doing research for a month with all the statistics and data and the way that everybody else did it, he made up a story that illustrated what he'd learned. And his bosses loved it. He was the only one writing stories. And so they would share it with their peers and their bosses. And so every month he started getting this bigger and bigger readership of people reading his memos, even people that didn't work in his department. And eventually he became one of the most widely read and recognized and influential people in the company. the CEO would want to read his monthly memo. And so they eventually appointed him the corporate storyteller. And that fascinated me. And I'm sure there was more than a tinge of jealousy in there. I wanted to be that person. And so I set about trying to learn the art and the science of storytelling after that. He's definitely one of my favorites.
Well, that's a great story about storytellers. What would you say are the top 3 or 4 skills that a great corporate storyteller needs to have?
First of all, I think I've mentioned this, having a large repertoire of stories. It's hard to be a great storyteller if you don't have good stories to tell. You need to be consciously, mentally filing away these stories so that you have lots of good stories to tell at a moment's notice. I think being able to tell a story short and succinctly makes one a good storyteller. So these stories ought to be 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, 5 at the most, right? These are not long stories that you tell around the office. If you're telling 10 or 15-minute stories, you're probably not a great storyteller. Great storytellers have stories that resonate with people emotionally. They connect with them on an emotional, human level. So that I think makes you a good storyteller. The surprise ending too. I think that certainly stories with a great surprise ending is a very memorable component of a story. So naturally gifted storytellers kind of do this somehow by second nature. Most of us have to study that art and intentionally put those things in, but that's exactly why I do what I do for a living, is teach people those tricks of the trade so that you can craft great stories, even if you're not a naturally gifted storyteller.
We've all gone to presentations. We've all been in venues when we feel connected to the stories because of great storytelling. And it always seems to me as if there's that combination of skills, but there's also sometimes there are qualities that great storytellers have. And I'm wondering if beyond the skills, are there qualities that you've seen time and time again in great storytellers? That's the amorphous, the qualities, things like curiosity or empathy. When you look back at storytellers, they have those traits as well.
I'll give you a few things that I think is on my list and a few things that you might expect to be that are not. So being curious, of course, is always helps one out in almost any venue in life. The difference between people who always seem to have a great story to tell and people who don't, I used to think that it was, well, those people just lead a more interesting life than I do, right? They just always got some interesting story to tell. But I don't believe that anymore. I think all of us have interesting things that happen in life. And many of the stories we tell shouldn't even be about us anyway. They're about other people. So now what I've concluded is that in addition to being curious, that like you mentioned, is that good storytellers are just observant. They notice when something interesting happens and mentally register it as, oh, that's an interesting story I'll tell someday when it's appropriate. 10 other people saw the same thing happen, but the good storyteller will remember it and tell other people about it. So that's the big difference. What's not on my list that people often think would be or should be is that I don't think of what makes a great storyteller as, oh, they've got a good resonant voice and they make good eye contact and they seem to know naturally what to do with their hands and they're charismatic and engaging. And, those things are nice. If you tell a story using all of those kind of oral delivery techniques, will it make your story better? Of course. You don't need that, right? The story is more important than the delivery. When you're talking about the kind of leadership, sales, marketing stories I'm talking about, if you're a professional speaker or an actor, yeah, you better nail that stuff or you'll get booed off stage. But most of us aren't professional speakers and actors. We're just people who work. And so people don't expect the perfection in delivery when you're telling a story, but they do expect you to tell them an interesting story that will help them. So if you deliver a story with the performance that would make a Shakespearean actor proud, but it wasn't the right story to tell and didn't help your audience, they will never forgive you for wasting their time, right? The story is more important than the delivery.
One of the things that Andrew and I do a lot of work in is around change communications, right? And particularly in large organizations, the change never stops. And I'm wondering about the role of stories in helping people navigate through change. So more than just the setting values and communicating policy, are stories a useful thing when we are in the midst of change?
Yeah, in fact, there's 2 or 3 types of stories that I think help you navigate a major change. And the first one is the case for change. Why is there a problem? Why can't we just keep doing things the way we are now? Because most people don't like change. Change is different. Change is difficult. Change requires effort. It's easy to just do what we're doing. So the first story you need to tell when a change is necessary is tell the story of the problem that is happening that will convince people that the status quo is unacceptable. Right, so that's the first story, why we need to change. The second story in that chain is typically what our vision is for the future. What do we want to do differently in the future so that we won't have the same problems that we're having now? And then after that, there could be a number of different stories you might tell. I've had clients who then want to tell the story of how we're going to get there. What's our strategy to accomplish that? I have other clients that want to tell the story of why you should believe us that this time it's going to work, because I know we've had 3 changes in the last 5 years and none of them worked. And so now we've got a credibility issue. So now we need to tell a story to help convince you that this time it's going to work. But those first 2 almost certainly go into that communication set for any change. Why we have to change and what we want to change to. What is the vision?
I gather from the leaders that you've worked with that you've come across leaders who often assume that they are natural, great storytellers. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, knowing that some will believe that, and in truth they may not be, what do you point to in order to demonstrate to them that perhaps they aren't as good at storytelling as they think they are?
What an interesting question. So fortunately, most of the leaders I work with have the opposite problem. They assume that they're just terrible at telling stories. And so they're afraid to do it. They just want to stand up and read from the teleprompter or follow their message track. And they're afraid to tell stories because they think they'll just butcher it because they don't know what they're doing. And most of them don't know what they're doing in terms of storytelling, but that's why they're in my class, right? To learn that. There obviously are a few who you don't get to be in the most senior positions without having at least some ego. So that yes, there are always a few who think they're better than they are. Fortunately, I don't have to tell them, you're not nearly as good of a storyteller as you seem to think you are, because the way I conduct the class is, well, they'll find that out pretty quickly because everybody that comes to class has to share a story. And then the rest of us critique the story. So not just me, but everybody in class. And we do it in a productive way. So it's okay. Here's what we liked about your story. Here's what worked. Here's what made the story hang together based on all the techniques that we've learned during the day. But here are the parts that didn't really work that well. And here's the specific technique change that we would recommend to help you make that story better. And if you have a leader in there who shares a story and here's 2 things we like about it and there's 15 things we think you could do better, it'll become pretty obvious to them that it wasn't the best story in the world. And they're hearing that from a bunch of people they know and trust and care about who are sharing that feedback, A, because they have to, that's what we're doing in this class, and B, they're doing it because they want to help them be a better storyteller. So it's a pretty safe environment.
It does sound like a safe environment, sometimes within organizations that because of egos, because of constraints put on leaders, because of their own reputation or credibility gaps, it may not be quite as safe. How would you suggest to an employee communications person or an HR person, hey, you've got to let them know they're not that good at storytelling?
So you could call me and I'll have that conversation with them. That's part of my job. But it's just like any sensitive kind of conversation, you want to do it in private. You certainly wouldn't want to tell them right in the middle of the staff meeting that, you kind of suck at storytelling. And at the same time, you would offer them, as a good corporate communications person would, some solutions. So Elizabeth, you could let them borrow the book that you have. Here's one solution, or we could go take this class, or we could watch some videos or whatever. You personally can coach them a little bit. So you always want to have a solution handy and to deliver it in private.
One of the things that struck me, your advice that leaders need to have a repertoire of stories. And I guess the thing I wonder about is, how do we go about collecting stories? Individually, of course, we've got the stories we all tell that we remember and we tell over and over again until our children beg us to stop. But in a corporate context, I think want to make sure that we're collecting stories, we're keeping them, we're curating them, and we're not letting them dwindle. How do you collect corporate stories?
Great question. There are a number of different ways, and I have clients who do it all kinds of different ways. Some of the really sophisticated ones literally have computer databases where they write the stories down, or they'll videotape somebody telling the story, and they literally have a database where they capture these stories. And there are actually some online solutions for that, just literally story databases where you can capture the story in whatever format you have. Others more rely on their own memory, but what they do is they spend time encouraging people to share them. And so they'll do clever things like once a month, they'll have a story circle, which basically means we've randomly invited 30 employees to have a pizza lunch, and we'll order pizza for everybody. And there's only 2 rules for the next hour in this room. 1 is eat your pizza or whatever you want to eat. And 2, share stories. But that's all you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to talk about your current business problem or your barbecue this weekend or whatever. You just need to share stories. Stories about work that will generate a bunch of stories. And you can assign a note taker to record them somehow. Personally, I literally capture my stories in a single Microsoft Word document in bullet point form. So the answer to the 8 most important questions, which I don't think we've talked about that yet, but there are 8 questions that I coach people that your story needs to answer, and in this particular order to have a well-structured story. Well, I just capture the 8 bullet points with a title on it, and then a page later is another story. And so I can literally go into this one document and search for, oh, what was that story about Sam Walton or the ironing board covers or something? I just, I'll type ironing board cover and boom, that story comes up. So to me, that's my personal way of doing it, but there's certainly others as well.
Now, you've collected more than 3,000 organizational stories over the years. And given how much our leaders love numbers, I'm wondering, is there a way that organizations and leaders can use metrics to understand the effectiveness of stories? Communicators are always being pushed to measure what we do.
Yeah, I know. It's the bane of all of our existences is trying to financially quantify the benefit of our existence, right? My answer will probably be frustrating or the same as any corporate communications person is I know anecdotally that it works because my clients tell me it works. But what I haven't seen, there have been some academics who've tried to quantify it, and they've documented that stories make facts between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if they're embedded in a story. And there's never been a company, I would imagine, in the history of the world who has said, you know what? Starting Monday, we're all going to start telling stories, but we're not going to change anything else about our business for the next 6 months, and then we'll see what happens. It's just never happened. So there's really not a good way to say, see, 5,000 people started telling stories on Monday, and by Wednesday, our sales doubled or something like that. That's just not going to happen. But what I do have is literally hundreds of executive clients who tell me, wow, I am so much more effective as a leader now that I am practiced at this art of storytelling. And my people are more clear on my objectives. They're more eager and willing to follow my leadership. I seem to be a more charismatic and engaging leader. And this is like clearly the only thing I've changed. And so talk to somebody who knows a great storyteller around the office, and they will tell you, I want that skill set because I see the way people listen to and look at and follow that person who's a great leader. And how could that not be effective in an organization?
All the discussion, I think, so far that we've talked about stories and storytelling begins with an assumption that these are very positive or purpose-driven stories that we're hoping people to become better at delivering. There's a deliberateness to them. There's also a dark side of storytelling and stories. And in reality, during catastrophic changes within organizations, often negative stories arise, and often in the form of rumors. So there you have compelling stories, and they're often rooted in fear, misinformation, bias, and they're spreading throughout an organization like wildfire, right? So what makes rumors such compelling stories? And from a storytelling perspective, what actions can you tell an HR professional or a comms professional, what can you tell them to do to address these stories? Like, do we carpet bomb them with other stories? Do we try to undermine the stories? Do we attempt to dislodge them? Do we torpedo the tellers and the sharers of the rumors? So how do we use storytellers to make good of bad stories?
Let me answer the second question first while it's still fresh in my mind. And all except for the last one that you just mentioned are certainly fair game. I would never recommend undermining the person who shared the story. I don't think that's generally good practice. And I probably wouldn't use the word carpet bombing, but in general, you can't stop people from telling stories, right? You just cannot issue by edict, thou shalt not tell this story, this bad story ever again, right? It's hard to offset it simply with a set of facts. The best way to get rid of a bad story is to replace it with a good story. So you've got to find and create that story. So if people are telling a bad story about how the company responded to some situation, I mean, if it's not true, of course, that's when you would just simply go in and say, look, this isn't true. Here are the real facts. So the story you're hearing is simply not true. Probably there's some truth to it, though. And most stories have some truth in them. That's how they got started. The way you get rid of them is by replacing them with more interesting, good stories that address the same topic and that scratch the same itch. That's what gets into your first question, is why are these stories so interesting that people want to keep telling them? And that's because they're kind of salacious. You know, you tune into a podcast called The Swear Jar and you're expecting people to drop the F-bomb. I'm kind of waiting for both of you to do that, you know? And I think
shit, we haven't. Yeah.
Exactly. So I've dropped a couple of not so terrible swear words so far, and you didn't yell at me. So I'm getting a little braver, and the next one might be a little worse. And right. So we're naturally attracted to train wrecks and salacious material and people getting fired and like the, you know, scandalous rumors. And so you need stories that have some of that component. It's just that it was a good result instead of a bad result. And then people will want to tell that story instead of the bad story.
Let's address the story sucking elephant in the room right now, which is, of course, COVID-19. And we're recording this in early May of 2020. And we're just seeing our clients are starting to emerge from the lockdown. And they are actually starting to tell their own stories about what happened to them, to their clients, to their customers, to their employees during this. I'm wondering, in your mind, I feel a sense of urgency around collecting those stories on behalf of our clients, because I feel like they might go away if we don't collect them and start telling them now. Do stories expire? Like, what's the shelf life of one of these?
They do, but for a couple of very different reasons. A story I could use your word, expire, if people just forget about it. People retire, they move on. And so the story is just gone because nobody captured it and wrote it down, which is exactly why you need to capture them in more of a tangible database fashion, like we talked about earlier. The other reason you might say they would expire is that they just become no longer useful. So people could keep telling them, but they wouldn't be working any longer because, well, the times have changed. There are better examples of that now. It's just an irrelevant story now. So it just doesn't do you any good to keep telling it. In fact, it just kind of bores people now. And that's why you need to constantly be collecting more stories, because some of them will expire all the time for both of those reasons. To your first point, yes, I agree with you. We should be capturing some of these, COVID-19 crisis stories now, because surely a year from now or 2 years from now or 10 years from now, when something similar happens, we're going to want to look back and be able to tell people what we did right, what we did wrong, how these things impacted people. And we're going to wonder, and if somebody didn't have the foresight to write these things down or to capture them somehow, it's going to be unfortunate.
It feels like there's probably a good opportunity to use these COVID stories to contribute to the way we understand organizational culture and values. And I'm interested in how stories work in terms of defining culture and helping to inculcate values, whether COVID related or not.
Well, so one example would be the Sam Walton story that I shared with you earlier. I'll give you another one here that is about a crisis situation. So it's not a disease crisis, but a similar crisis situation. And you'll be able to see the corporate values playing out in this situation. So this one was a company called BK Finance, which was an online lending platform in London back around the year 2000 with the dot-com bubble and burst. And so it was a very small business, 25 employees. The owner and founder of the company is a guy named Andrew Moorfield. And something happened to him in that company, which happens to a lot of fledgling companies. And that is, at one point, they ran out of cash. All right. So he literally didn't have enough money to make payroll. And so he had a decision. Well, what am I going to do? And what he did about it was he called all 25 employees into a room. He sat them down. He went up to the whiteboard and he wrote a number at the top of the whiteboard. He said, that was our bank account balance at the beginning of the month. And then he wrote two numbers underneath that. And he said, those are the revenues and expenses that we'll be getting during the month and having to pay during the month to keep running the company. And he drew a line underneath it. He did the math and he put the answer at the bottom and he circled that number. And he said, so that is how much money we're going to have in the bank at the end of the month to pay all of your salaries. Then right next to it, he wrote another number and he circled it. And he said, and that is how much all of your salaries add up to. And then he just stood there and let them take in the dire consequences of what they saw in front of them, because the number on the right was 3 times the size of the number on the left. So the salaries added up to 3 times as much as the bank would have in it to pay them. Well, that's a problem, right? And so then he asked them, so if you were me, what would you do about this? Of course, he saw this coming for the last week or two, so he had plenty of time to think ahead of time. What would be the fairest thing to do? Well, should I lay off 2/3 of the staff, furlough 2/3 of people, or should I cut everybody's salary by 2/3? That, by the way, that second thing was what he thought was the fairest thing to do. But he didn't tell them that. He asked them, what would you do if you were me? And they thought about it and talked about it amongst themselves for 10 or 15 minutes. And they came to the conclusion, much to his horror, we think 2/3 of the people in this room should not get paid this month. And the other 1/3 should get 100% of their salary. And he was just aghast at that. He's like, how on earth am I going to decide which 2/3 of you not to pay? And that's when they surprised him a second time. They said, well, you don't have to. We'll decide amongst ourselves. Go out in the hallway, give us 15 minutes. So he did. He went out there, and of course he's thinking, well, what are they going to decide? And he assumed, well, they're going to decide like I thought all along. He would like them to pay everybody 1/3. But he said they'll probably decide that the senior executives who are wealthier, they can probably afford to, skip a paycheck or two. They'll be fine. But the junior people, the new hires, they're probably living paycheck to paycheck. I probably need to pay them. So that's what he went back in assuming they'd say. And that's when they surprised him a third time. They said, we think you should pay the executives all of their salaries, and the junior folks should get nothing. And again, he's like, what? Are people nuts? Like, why would you decide that? And it was a young 20-something new hire who was telling him this is the decision of the group. And we're all in unanimous agreement to it. And they explained that, look, I'm 23 years old. I live with a couple of my best friends downtown in an apartment, month-to-month rent. I can literally leave tomorrow and go live with my parents for the next couple of months. I'll be fine. But these executives, she's a single mom. She's got 2 kids at home. That guy's got a mortgage and college funds to build. We just don't have that kind of debt service. We'll be fine. And so, he honored that decision and paid them that way. Now, 2 months later, the business turned around and everybody got caught up and everything was fine. But the point is, here in this crisis moment, he did something, 2 or 3 things that I think is worth communications professionals of taking note of. First of all, if anybody ever told a story with 5 numbers, it was Andrew Moorfield on that day, right? He brilliantly told a story about the bank account with 5 numbers on a whiteboard. And like good storytelling, there was a surprise ending, there was some emotional engagement, and importantly, he let the audience draw the conclusion, which is what you do in good storytelling. You don't tell people how to think about the story when you're done. You tell them the story and let them decide how to think about the story. He did all of that with numbers on a whiteboard. So it was a brilliant use of storytelling, all right? But secondly, notice that instead of him telling them what the corporate CEO's decision was, he asked them, what would you do if you were me? And the brilliance of that is 2 things. First of all, your people might give you a better idea than you had on your own. And in that case, they did. But even if they don't have a better idea, 9 times out of 10, if you've hired smart people, they're going to tell you what you've already decided you're going to do anyway, because they're smart like you. They're going to come to the same conclusion. And how much easier is it to tell a group of people, I'm going to have to furlough 2/3 of you, or I'm going to have to cut 2/3 of your pay, if they just told you, if I were you, I would cut my pay by 2/3. It's very easy to do. But if you haven't given them the chance to weigh into the decision and you're just telling them, hey, I'm the boss, I'm cutting your pay by 2/3, that's a hard sell. But if you've given them a chance to weigh in and tell you what they would do, it just makes it so much easier. So there are a lot of lessons, I think, to learn from that one story.
Yeah, because you hear in that story, very quickly you understand the company culture, you understand that leader's values, the employees' values, the shared values, the not so shared values, and also the whole power of a small number of numbers. I had a boss once whose mantra was no 5 numbers. And so even though there were a million things on the corporate dashboard, every employee in the organization, this was a 30,000 person organization, just had to know these 5 metrics and what they meant.
I listened to that story, and of course, I'm listening to you telling the story as well as I'm curious about how the story was told as well. One of the things that is a theme with all of our clients and all the work that we do with clients is helping people listen, to structure in listening. And storytelling is very much a listening process as much as it is a telling process. In that story you just related, the senior executive built in listening. Now he built listening into and dovetailed that with decision making, right? He could have listened to their input and denied their decision making authority. So he dovetailed both. But from our perspective, he built in listening into the successful telling of that story. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. That's a good observation that I hadn't made before. I appreciate you adding that. And I recognize, that's a story about a company of 25 people, not 30,000. So you certainly wouldn't want your CEO going onto a 30,000 person webcast and asking for their input right at that moment. But you could do that at the department level manager level. So you push down the deployment of the crisis response and let the people at that level collect that kind of input and then tell people what's going to happen. Because again, probably the same thing. You're going to have people in the room that tell them, I would do exactly what you are about to tell me that we're going to do.
Excellent. We've had a great discussion so far. Why don't you tell us a bit about your newest book?
Yeah, happy to. So my latest book is the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. Elizabeth, you've got that first one, Lead with a Story. And as you're working through that, you're probably reading dozens and dozens of stories. In fact, I think there's probably 115 or something like that in there. So one thing I could certainly be accused of fairly is not being very focused in that first book. So what I tried to do in this most recent book is to focus on just the 10 most important stories that I think any leader needs to be able to tell. So the entire book, there's only 10 stories in the book. And it's just one example of each of these 10. You could probably read the whole book in an hour. So it's designed for, an executive level read. If you're interested, I'd be happy to just ruin the table of contents for you and tell you what those 10 are. Is that of interest?
By all means.
So here's the first four because they kind of go together. Where we came from. So that's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's that case for change story that we talked about earlier. Where we're going, which is a vision story. And how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, a story about how we're going to get from where we are now to where we want to be. The next four kind of go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So number 5 is what we believe. So that's that corporate values story that we talked about earlier. The Sam Walton Ironing Board story is an example of that. Who we serve. So that's a customer story. That's number 6, a story about your customer so people can understand who you're working for on a personal human level. What we do for our customers. So that's a sales story, classical sales story, basically a story about what you do that's so awesome that people should pay you money to do it, right? And then number 8 is how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story because marketing is typically about how you're different from your competitors. All right, so that gets us to 8. The last 2 kind of go together as well, but they're more about you personally as the leader. So number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. So you the person you're talking to, right? Because it's not just the job of HR and recruiting to bring in talented people. Every leader needs to, at some point during the day or the week of the month, attract strong talent to the organization, have them stay and thrive and follow your leadership. So you need dozens of types of stories, I think, in your world. But if you wanted a list of the most important 10 or a good place to start, that's what I think those 10 are.
And again, the title of the book is?
The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell.
And Paul is going to be making some of those available, and we're going to make some of those available to our listeners.
Yes, happy to do that.
I'm just going to do a quick summary. So we've covered a lot today, and jump in if I've missed something. First lesson, recognize the time to tell a story. And that is largely to motivate or add clarity around something that's nebulous. 2, make sure you can choose the right story. So have a repertoire, and you've just gone through 10 types of stories that people should be having in their repertoire. 3, when crafting a story, make sure that it has a structure, that it has emotion, surprise, perhaps dialogue and detail. Number 4, as far as qualities or skills for storytelling, be short and succinct. Make sure that stories resonate emotionally with people. 5, traits to have curiosity and being observant. Another element Paul pointed out is that it's important to have case for change and a vision for the future. Next, collect stories to share them, whether that's in a database or through more informal means. As far as rumors are concerned, replace them with good stories. And finally, Paul, I'll leave the last thing that you want to emphasize. What would you like to highlight?
I guess I would just say treat storytelling like any other leadership skill, as something that you would want to go study and get good at, as opposed to just leaving it to fate as to whether or not you're going to be a good storyteller. So storytelling is an art, but it can be learned just like any other art form. You just need to study it from somebody who knows. So go read a book, take a class, watch some YouTube videos, and you can master the art.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You've certainly showed today that there is a discipline to telling stories.
I would add to that, I think that corporate communications people have an opportunity, and I would argue even an obligation, to keep pushing their leadership toward this skill set, because it's one of those that often feels squishy, and a lot of executives don't like squishy. It feels fluffy, and I think that our comms community really needs, I would argue now more than ever, to start putting storytelling on that executive agenda and looking for opportunities to highlight it, not just important for culture and values and policies, but as a way that leadership is actually enacted in the organization. So I would say that the action I'm taking away is that we need to be much more explicit with leaders and saying, like, you've got to have this on your list of things you're really good at. And communicators, I think, have an opportunity to step up and really make that point.
Absolutely. I mean, if your communications people aren't the ones crafting these stories, who are you leaving it up to?
Yeah, right. Leaders, sadly. Yeah.
Paul, before we go, we'd like to do a quick go around the table and see what people are listening to, what they're reading, what they're watching. Can you share with us something that's really resonating with you?
I had just started reading a book called I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up by James Hogan. While I definitely am a storyteller and that's my profession, I also fancy myself interested in more general forms of communication, and public discourse is one of those. So I'm fascinated by why we are unable to have more productive, rational, civil conversations in the public square than we are today, especially on mediums like social media. And I'm hoping that this book will help me understand how to do that better.
Elizabeth.
Several things. First of all, I'm going to do a shameless shill for our latest ebook, which is our third in the series of Fearless Communications Guides to Scary Global Pandemics. And in volume 3, we look at how to communicate with remote workers. So that is a shameless shill. I will also mention that for our listeners, all of the books mentioned in here, we will make sure we have links to in the podcast notes. It's interesting, related to what you just mentioned, Paul, about discourse. The thing that caught my ears this week was a podcast by Mitch Joel. He does the 6 Pixels of Separation podcast. He's been doing it for years and it's wonderful. But this week in particular, I actually listened to it twice because he was interviewing the great Henry Mintzberg, the McGill professor who is increasingly impatient with organizations and the way society is out of balance. And so he did a great interview with Henry Mintzberg about Mintzberg's Rebalancing Society book and his declaration of interdependence. And it is so worth a listen, particularly in the context of our polarization. And in fact, Paul, I would recommend reading Henry's thing next, because I think it may answer some of the questions about why everybody's right and everyone else is an idiot. So really caught my attention.
Very good. Thanks for that.
For my part, I revisited another one, Discovering Common Grounds. Talk about a common theme between the 3 things that are all grabbing our attention. This is a resource by Marvin Weisberg, and he set up structures for and between organizations on how to better listen, innovate, and collaborate with one another. And so that's what Common Ground is. It's the terminology is search conferences, but that's kind of an icky term because you think about search and you think about conferences. This is something else. It's about setting ground rules so that people can get together and collaborate productively while listening to one another and coming up and developing shared visions.
Very nice.
So before we go, Paul, what are you working on now and how can people get in touch with you?
So I actually just had another book come out after that, 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. I didn't mention it because it's not a book on storytelling, but it's a biography of a deaf man. And he's deaf in both ears and partially blind in one eye and couldn't speak till he was 10 years of age, and also has a significant learning disability. So he's a bit of a combination of like Helen Keller and Forrest Gump, but a real live one, unlike Forrest Gump. And he's just a fascinating human being. And I've written his biography, and it was a 6-year journey for me to capture this man's life. And it's just fascinating, harrowing, joyous, sad, tragic, hilarious life that he's led as a result of coming into this world with all of those challenges. And so the book just came out right before this whole COVID-19 thing hit. Our book tour got cut short. Nobody's buying books anymore. So it just became a tragic time to have launched a book about this beautiful man. And so right now I'm trying to figure out how to pivot and make that book work for him and for the world, because I think the world would just be a better place when they get to know him. That's what I'm struggling with right now.
What's the title of the book again?
Thank you. It's 4 Days with Kenny Tedford, obviously his name, and in referencing the 4 main days that he spent at my house sharing his life story, and just started with, me taking notes. And before we were done, my wife and 2 kids were like hunkered over my shoulder, couldn't tear away from a single word that the man was saying. So very seriously impacted in a beautiful way my entire family, just coming and gracing us with those 4 days of sharing his stories.
Wow, again, the power of story.
Mm-hmm.
How can people get in touch with you?
My website's probably the easiest way. So that's LeadwithaStory.com. And there's links to all my books, including that last one, and descriptions of the training courses that I teach, and contact information for me, and all that stuff is there.
Hey, great. Well, that is it for us. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Paul, for taking time out of your day to join us. If you like this podcast, please leave a rating, or better still, subscribe.
And of course, you can check out the show notes and resources at academyofbusinesscommunications.com. See you next time.
Bye-bye.